states in population, and then the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is an olive branch to those large states in population. The more people who reside in your state, the more people who live in your state, the more representation you'll have in what we refer to as the lower chamber. So we take the census every 10 years, in part to account for those population shifts. We have 435 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. Each state has at least one member in the U.S. House of Representatives. Some states are so small that they only have one House member. So Alaska, Delaware, these states only have one member in the U.S. House of Representatives. States that are large in terms of population, like California, which is the largest state, has the most members in the U.S. House of Representatives with 52 members, as we will see here in the next slide. The census also is used to determine the amount of federal funding states and local jurisdictions will receive. The census is important because it can determine whether infrastructure is needed in a specific area based upon population shifts that occur within that 10-year window. On the next slide, we see apportionment of the U.S. House of Representatives based on the 2020 census. If you look at the very top of the map, you'll see the legend change from 2010 to 2020. States that are this darkest shade of green gain 2 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. States that are in the lightest shade of green gained 1 seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. States that are white had no change, and states that are purple lost a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. And I think many of us are probably aware that students' ability to interpret graphs or charts or maps is suspect at times. And even for the professionals who are on this call, sometimes it can be difficult to interpret exactly the overall theme of what I'm trying to make the point here, which is that Texas was the biggest winner as a result of the 2020 census. We gained 2 seats. No other state gained more than 1 seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. And this also represents the second census where Texas was also the biggest winner. In 2010, 10 years ago, or I should say 12 years ago, in the 2010 census, Texas gained 4 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. In fact, we oftentimes compare Texas to California, and while it comes to our political party affiliation and support for presidential candidates, yes, California is described as a blue state, Texas is described as a red state, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of population, in terms of the economy, and yet you look at the last 30 years, or excuse me, the last 3 censuses that have been conducted in 2000, 2010, and 2020, we see a trend beginning to emerge. And that trend, of course, is that in 2000, the state of California gained 1 seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Texas gained 2. In the 2010 census, California didn't gain any, but it also didn't lose any seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. As we've already mentioned, Texas gained 4 seats. In 2020, California, for the first time in its state's history, actually lost a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, whereas once again, Texas gained 2. So the last 3 censuses, California 1, 0, -1, Texas 2, 4, 2. And some people predict that at some point here in the 21st century, Texas could surpass California as the most populous state in the country. And of course, that would be reflected on the census in subsequent decades. So in 2030, 2040, 2050. Texas now has 38 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. And every state has to redraw their congressional district boundaries, except for those states that are so small in terms of population, they only have 1 member in Congress. So for instance, the Dakotas, North Dakota and South Dakota are so small they only have 1 member that represents them in the House, the U.S. House of Representatives. So they won't have to redraw the congressional maps, because the whole entire state is that map, so to speak. That being said, however, in North Dakota, South Dakota, and even those states that only have one member in Congress, they still will have to redraw district boundary maps for their members of Congress, excuse me, their members in the state legislature. And here in Texas, we know that the state legislature is in charge of redrawing not only the congressional district maps, but also the state legislature maps for the state Senate, the Texas House of Representatives, and the members of the State Board of Education. This is a tremendous amount of authority vested in the state legislature. In fact, you could argue that it's perhaps one of the most important things that the state legislature addresses. In fact, if we go one step further, you could make an argument that this was the most consequential election in the last 20 years. And that has nothing to do with former President Trump, the pandemic, or any other external factor beyond the fact that in 2020, not only were we voting for president, but we also had a census conducted. And the census ultimately will impact the representatives we have that represent the state for the next 10 years, and also the policies that are pursued at the state level and our representation in Washington, D.C. when it comes to our members in the House of Representatives. So if you put it all together, this election, because in 2010, that was not a presidential election. In 2030, that's not a presidential election. You have to go another 20 years till 2040 when you have so much at stake in one election cycle. I'm going to transition here to what exactly is redistricting. And I feel as if I need to provide the definition for a couple of key terms that we're going to be talking about today. We talk about apportionment. Apportionment is the allocation of House seats to the states after the census is conducted. That was the previous slide we were looking at. And redistricting is just simply the process of redrawing those district lines. And let's imagine that Texas, once again, had no, and let's imagine that Texas didn't gain any nor lose any House seats. Of course, we know we did gain 2 House seats, but let's say we didn't. Well, we'd still have to engage in what we refer to as redistricting, the redrawing of those district lines. And I think someone maybe wants to raise their hand and say, well, why? Why would we have to do that if there's no change? Because of population shifts that continue to occur, not only in Texas, but all over the United States of America. We continue to see this trend of more and more people moving from rural areas to large urban centers. In fact, if we were to go back to the late 19th century, around 85% of all Texans lived in rural areas. Galveston in the late 19th century was bigger than Houston. And yet today it's flip-flopped. Around 85% of all Texans live in urban areas. In fact, 3 of the top 10 largest cities in America are right here in the state of Texas. 6 out of the top 21 largest cities in America are right here in the state of Texas. So most Texans live in urban areas, and more Texans in rural counties are moving to counties such as Harris, Travis, Dallas, Tarrant, Bexar, El Paso counties, and the surrounding counties that are part of those large metropolitan areas. Texas residents, U.S. House seats, U.S. House, Texas Senate, and State Board of Education, these are all impacted as a result of those redrawing of district boundary lines. Every state is different, it should be noted, when we talk about who has the ability to redraw those district maps. In Texas, that authority is given to the Texas legislature, and it's signed into law by the governor. Should be noted at the local level, we do have county commissioner precincts. Those are also redrawn as well. So every state is different. And here in the next slide or two, we're going to look at states and how they determine who's going to redraw those district boundary lines. The slide you're looking at is control of congressional redistricting 2021 to 2022. We can see that when it comes to Republican control, out of those 435 House districts, right? So once again, there are 435 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. Who gets to control the redrawing of those boundaries and those district lines? Well, out of the 435, 187 are controlled by Republicans, as is Texas. As you can see, Texas is located within that category. Democratic control for those congressional districts.
You're muted.
Thank you so much. I must have accidentally pushed mute there. And we can see that in some states, we have advisory bodies that are in control of redistricting, and some states have commissions. When we talk about commissions or advisory bodies, oftentimes they are nonpartisan. Oftentimes, when we specifically talk about commissions, their objective is not to benefit one political party or another. It's just simply to draw districts that are competitive in nature. We look at traditional redistricting principles. So what goes into the process of redistricting, the redrawing of those district boundary maps? Well, they need to be compact, or at least in theory, that should be a goal. They also need to be contiguous. You can't have one district, say in El Paso, the 16th Congressional District, and say the 36th Congressional District, which is in East Texas. You couldn't have those be part of the same district. They have to actually touch each other. Now, sometimes districts are very thin and narrow. In fact, there's an old joke, and I don't know how funny it is, but it goes, there was this congressional district in North Carolina, and it was long, it was elongated, it was narrow, and the joke goes that if you got in your car and you opened up the driver's side door and the passenger side door and drove in a straight line, you'd kill everybody in the district because it was so narrow. And sometimes, like I said, districts are no more wide than, say, a street. But in theory, they need to try to be compact. That doesn't always happen. We see that another traditional principle of redistricting is communities of interest and political competitiveness. And what we mean by communities of interest, it is noteworthy to mention here that when it comes to the courts and redistricting, for a majority of our nation's history, the courts really didn't weigh into these topics. Now it seems as if almost every single year the courts are hearing challenges to states and their redistricting plans, as is the case here in Texas. In fact, ever since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which requires pre-clearance for states that have a history of discrimination before they have some new policy implemented, Texas has seen their attempts at redistricting challenged by other entities, and oftentimes the court striking down at the very first attempt by the legislature to redraw those district lines. So this is a very partisan process. Obviously, politics is kind of at the root core of this. And when we look at the history of redistricting, it was just 60 years ago, in 1962, in Baker versus Carr, a famous U.S. Supreme Court case that established that the courts do, in fact, have jurisdiction when it comes to weighing in on redistricting matters. In 1964, in Reynolds versus Sims, The U.S. Supreme Court established that districts need to be nearly equal in terms of population, and that at the very least, you must redistrict once every 10 years. And the reason for this deals with many southern states such as Tennessee and Alabama, who by the 1960s had not redrawn their district boundary maps in some cases in nearly 60 years, going back to the turn of the century, back in around 1900. And so you saw great disparities where rural districts were overrepresented in terms of their weight in the state legislature or in Congress. People who lived in rural districts, their vote was worth more than someone who lived in an urban setting in those states. And so in Reynolds versus Sims, the U.S. Supreme Court establishes essentially the one person, one vote doctrine, which is that districts must be nearly equal. Now, notice I said that you must engage in redistricting once every 10 years, at least. There's nothing preventing states from engaging in what we refer to as mid-cycle redistricting. And this can occur in between. So yes, we're talking about redistricting here for 2022 midterm elections, but there's nothing stopping the legislature from engaging in redistricting in, say, 2025. It's unusual. It's seen as overtly political, but it has happened here in Texas. For those of you who remember, it happened nearly 20 years ago, back in 2003. And once Republicans regained control of the state legislature as a result of the 2002 midterms, there was a redistricting process to reflect their new power and give them additional representation. And at the time, the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Tom DeLay, kind of spearheaded this initiative. Overview. I want to talk about how when we look at, say, the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump got 52.1% of the vote here in the state of Texas. So here in 2020, the election was much closer between Trump and Biden in terms of recent presidential elections. Yes, President Trump, former President Trump, won the state of Texas, but it was by a much closer percentage than what we've seen in previous presidential elections, such as, say, 2016 or 2012, really going back the last 2 decades. And so I think a lot of people ask, is this a sign that Texas has the potential to be a competitive two-party state? And the short answer is we don't know. There are so many different factors when we talk about realignment. Realignment is where a substantial group of voters switches party allegiance, producing a long-term change in the political landscape. Well, you don't even know if you've experienced a realignment until several election cycles have passed. So we'll be in a much better position to answer that question, say, a decade from now or beyond. Nonetheless, we look at here in the state of Texas, and we see that he would have prevailed in 57% of the new state House districts and in 61% of the new Senate districts and in 65% of the 38 congressional district seats. I want to point this out again. Remember, Texas gained 2 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. So in 2020, we had 36 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now we've got 38 members in the U.S. House of Representatives come the 2022 midterm election that will take place later this year. In 2020, those 36 seats, 9 were strong Biden, 13 were strong Trump, and 14 were competitive. Come the 2022 midterm elections, once again, we have 38 seats now in the U.S. House of Representatives. 12 are strong Biden, and 23 are strong Trump. 3 are competitive. So the takeaway is that obviously we've seen more districts here in the state of Texas that lean to the right, in this case that are strong Trump districts, and we've seen an increase in the number of districts that lean to the left and are strong Biden districts. What we've seen also is a reduction in the number of competitive districts that we have here in the state. What is gerrymandering? So let's do a quick recap. Apportionment is the allocation of House seats after the census is conducted. Redistricting is the redrawing of district boundary lines. Gerrymandering is where you redraw district boundary lines for partisan gain to benefit a particular political party. And I think that the knee-jerk reaction is that, okay, well, Republicans engage in gerrymandering here in Texas. And while that is true, it's important that we not point fingers here, because Democrats are guilty of the exact same thing in states where they control the state legislature. And historically, Texas has been dominated by the Democratic Party. Throughout a majority of our state's history, Democrats controlled the state legislature, and they engaged in the very exact same thing. So both political parties are guilty of this. This process of redrawing district boundary lines has a rich history in our nation's country, which is around 200 years old, goes back to the early 19th century there. So gerrymandering, and the courts have ruled on this over the last 60 years at this point, and it's interesting to see that evolution occur. And it changes from year to year, depending upon oftentimes the makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court and the lower courts as well, whether they're going to find the process of redistricting and maybe in a case like Texas, where you have the state legislature in charge of the redrawing of district boundary lines engaging in this overt partisan affair. We know that partisan gerrymandering is allowed, and preclearance is discouraged. Racial gerrymandering. This is an important Supreme Court case, 2013 Shelby County versus Holder. It ended the preclearance requirement. So I alluded to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which required states that have a history and political subdivisions that have a history of discrimination to get preclearance. Well, in Shelby County versus Holder, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the coverage formula, the maps that were used to require that states that had a history and political subdivisions that had a history of discrimination were as outdated. It was several decades old. And that if this preclearance needed to occur in the future, then Congress needed to redraw the maps. Well, that hasn't happened in the 9 years since. And thus it allowed states like Texas to pass, say, voter ID laws. And in the past, where maybe some of these state laws would have been struck down as a violation of the Voting Rights Act, now that preclearance isn't required. We look at the Supreme Court, and it seemed more willing to allow extreme partisan gerrymandering in states like Wisconsin and Alabama. And this kind of goes to the heart of our presentation, which is that, and I think I went back there, I'm sorry, went back in time, of our certain groups being underrepresented. So we take a look at some different themes here, what referred to as cracking and packing. Cracking, so the tools used by, in this case, the state legislature, when it comes to trying to maximize the number of Republicans who hold office, is to, in some cases, dilute the influence of the minority party. So you want to spread them out into as many different districts as possible, so there's less of a likelihood that the opposition party will win those, in this case, congressional seats. In other cases, you may want to put as many individuals who support the minority party into as few districts as possible. That way, all of the adjacent districts support the majority party. There's also a third tactic used that's not on this slide, which is what referred to as pairing. And that's where you force two incumbents. An incumbent is the current office holder seeking re-election. Incumbents enjoy a distinct advantage. they have name recognition, they performed constituent service, interest groups are more likely to back them and support them. This is where the majority party redraws district boundaries to force two incumbents who represent the same political party, in this case the opposition political party, to face each other in a primary. Essentially, the majority party is conceding they're going to lose that election. But you've created a situation where prior to redistricting, you had two incumbents representing the minority party. Now you only have one incumbent representing the minority party there. If we look at gerrymandering's gerrymandering secret weapon here, we see that geographic information systems, technology, and algorithms allow map makers to design districts with precision. My hope is, fingers crossed, we can play this short video. It's about just a few minutes long, but it really kind of summarizes the process of gerrymandering. So please let me know if you cannot hear this or it doesn't come through.
Will, we're not hearing any sound.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Thank you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and skip that there. I do apologize. What can you say? Technology, right? So we're going to go ahead and move on. What's the rush? Delays in the census created a rushed redistricting process, less time to challenge maps. Of course, we know that early voting began this week on Monday. And of course, we know that the primary election will take place on Tuesday, March 1st, just a couple of weeks from now. This is also the first redistricting cycle without a protection under the Voting Rights Act, known as pre-clearance, as I already referenced. So we've had an abbreviated time frame to really kind of collect our breath and look at the maps and allow for those legal challenges that inevitably will occur. And this creates a host of problems. The next slide we're looking at is those Texas congressional maps. On the left-hand side, you can see the old map with the 36 districts, and you can see how a majority of those districts were either solid red or light red meaning leaning towards the Republican Party. And then the districts that were gray were competitive, and then the districts that are blue were held by Democrats. And I think the initial takeaway that many of my students have when they first see maps such as this is, wow, Republicans dominate. And while that is true, it also can be slightly misleading because the districts held by Democrats are oftentimes in large urban areas. And remember, we talked about how districts have to be nearly equal in terms of population. We didn't say districts have to be nearly equal in terms of land size. So this very large district, and I don't know if you can see with my pointer here, but this very large district out here in West Texas is the 23rd Congressional District. Essentially, it has the same population as urban districts here in the city of Houston, such as the 18th Congressional District or the 29th Congressional District. And that gives you perhaps some additional information about where Democrats are successful, where they have strongholds, and where Republicans are the dominant political party. So in rural areas and in the suburbs, Republicans do much better than Democrats, and Democrats do much better than Republicans in those large, big cities. If we look here on the right, we can see, of course, once again, Texas gained those 2 House seats, and how the number of districts that trend towards the right and favor Republicans has increased. The number of competitive districts has decreased, and the number of districts held by Democrats has increased as well. What we're looking at here is U.S. House District 22. Of course, if you live right near Alvin Community College, then you live in House District 22. I know House District 14 is nearby. But nonetheless, it is interesting to note to see how the district has changed as a result of redistricting. So in 2020, this district voted at 49.7% for Trump and 48.8% for Biden, and we see that was won by less than 0.1%. This district is controlled by U.S. Representative Troy Nehls. And I believe that is a misprint, because that wouldn't be the case. That if oh, excuse me, yes, okay. So I'm glad that I stumbled over this. That's not a misprint. So what we're trying to say here is the constituents in District 22, 49.7% voted for Trump. Actually, the district went for Biden, and yet Nehls defeated the Democrat candidate there. In 2020, this new district would have voted 57.3% for Trump and 41.2% for Biden, and Trump would have won by 16.1 percentage points. So it gives you some indication of how, at the national level, it doesn't always correspond to the results at the local level. And in this case, you could make the argument that former President Trump was a drag on Troy Nehls and his ability to win the election. He won in spite of former President Trump, not because of him. And this goes against the essence of what we think about when it comes to coattails, having a strong presidential candidate who can bring into office individuals who are down the ballot, in this case, the U.S. House of Representatives. This is House District 29, held by Sylvia Garcia. And in 2020, this district voted 52.1% for Trump and 46.5% for Biden. And Trump won by 5.6 percentage points. This district is, we're talking about House District 29, House District 29. And this is represented by State Representative Ed Thompson. Among eligible voters, this district, and we see now this district in 2020 would have voted 57.9 for Trump and 40.6% for Biden. Trump would have won by 17.3%, a little over 17 percentage points there. And once again, it speaks to how districts have changed over time, and how in many cases Republicans have redrawn districts so it benefits their members, where districts maybe were a little bit more hotly contested just one election cycle ago, back in 2020, are now much more likely to elect a Republican. And this is pragmatic. To the victor go the spoils. By no means are we picking on the Republican Party. Democrats, like I had mentioned, do it in states where they control the process. This is Texas Senate District 11. This is held by the retiring State Senator Larry Taylor. I'm not going to spend too much time on this once again, but take away from this, once again, Republicans in many cases have redrawn district maps here at the state Senate level to further increase the number of Republicans who hold office. I really like this next slide that we're looking at. This is the 2022 consensus forecast of Houston area congressional districts. So the greater Houston area has nearly 7 million people. There are now 11 congressional districts that converge upon our 9-county metropolitan area. And I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but in the top left-hand corner of the map, so think northwest part of the region, this is the 10th congressional district held by Michael McCall, a Republican. In fact, this district stretches all the way to Austin. You have the 22nd congressional district held by Republican Troy Nehls. You have the 14th congressional district held by Randy Weber. And it should be noted, if the district is red, it's held by a Republican. If it's blue, it's held by a Democrat. This is the 36th congressional district held by Republican Brian Babin. In fact, it stretches all the way to the Sabine River, which, of course, separates Texas from Louisiana. This is the 2nd congressional district held by Dan Crenshaw, a Republican. This is the 8th congressional district. I know you can't see it, but trust me, it's the 8th congressional district held by Kevin Brady. And this is our new congressional district. So we talked about how Texas gained 2 congressional districts. One is in Houston and one is in Austin. And so the 38th congressional district most likely will elect a Republican. It's drawn in such a way to benefit a Republican. So that means the 7th congressional district is held by a Democrat, Lizzie Fletcher. The 9th congressional district is held by Al Green, a Democrat. The 29th congressional district, and this is the one I got confused on just a few minutes ago, I do apologize, is held by Sylvia Garcia. And the 18th congressional district is held by Sheila Jackson Lee. And so the 18th, 29th, 9th, and 7th are all held by Democrats. Now think about this just for a second. So in Harris County, which has gone blue in the last several election cycles, you look at Fort Bend County, which is one of the most diverse counties in the country in terms of race and ethnicity, and whose county judge is a Democrat. And yet, out of a large urban area, and we've already talked about how large urban areas oftentimes are more likely to support the Democratic Party, only 4 out of the 11 congressional districts do we forecast will be held by Democrats. And right now, prior to the 2022 midterm election, 6 out of the 10 are held by Republicans. So it's really not all that much more of a change, except for the fact that one of the new congressional districts we're receiving here in the state of Texas, in this case, in the Houston area, the 38th congressional district, most likely will be won by a Republican. This is Plan H2316, Texas House districts. So Texas has 150 House districts. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it shows you the lines of those new House districts. And if you're saying to yourself, well, I can't see 150 districts on there, it's because we would really have to zoom in for the large urban areas like the Metroplex, like Houston, San Antonio, and to an extent Austin, to see all of those districts. Remember, districts have to be nearly equal in terms of population, not land area. So the 74th Texas House District is incredibly big because there's hardly anybody who lives in this part of the state. This is Plan S2168, those 31 Texas Senate districts. This is always kind of important to point out, which is that Texas has more people who represent the state in the U.S. House of Representatives than it has state senators. State senators now represent around 1 million people. This is Plan E2106, those 15 Texas State Board of Education districts. And a lot of you all are probably familiar with the State Board of Education. It's a 15-member elected board. Individuals are elected from specific districts. The State Board of Education has a tremendous impact upon the curriculum and ultimately the textbooks that are adopted amongst the 1,200 or so school districts here in the state of Texas. Reading the Texas's congressional maps. This is from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Partisan fairness, we received an F. Significant Republican advantage. Competitiveness, some early competitive relative to other maps that could have been drawn. We got a C. In geographic features, non-compact districts, more county splits than typical. And so, just at first glance, this process of redistricting was highly partisan, lots of gerrymandering, and I think for a lot of us, we're not all that surprised. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, it should be noted that when you have competitive elections, when you have districts that are drawn in a way not to benefit one party or another, then you increase voter turnout. You, in some cases, perhaps create a situation where voters are more aware and cognizant of the issues that confront the state and the country. It reduces the impact of special interest groups when you have a healthy two-party competition. In addition, it prevents perhaps state lawmakers from pursuing a highly partisan agenda. And some people would argue that the state legislature hasn't focused enough on the significant issues and challenges that confront the state of Texas, and instead have focused on issues that are used to drum up support amongst the base. And you could look at recent pieces of legislation that deal with transgender. When you look at the abortion law that was passed not too long ago. This is grading Texas Senate maps. Once again, we received a C for partisan fairness, an F for competitiveness, and an F for geographic features. What new state districts show? Texas population grew by nearly 4 million from 2010 to 2020, and 95% of that growth was from people of color. In fact, for every white person here in the state of Texas that was added over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, we see that number is tenfold for people of color. So clearly that growth has come from Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians here in the state. Congressional districts with white majorities increased from 22 to 23. So now 23 out of those 38 congressional districts have white majorities. Congressional districts with Hispanic majorities decreased from 8 to 7. Congressional districts with black majorities decreased from 1 to 0. Congressional districts with no majorities increased from 5 to 8. So this slide is pretty impactful because it shows you the breakdown of the Texas population. Around 40% of the state's population is white, around 39% of the state's population is Hispanic, around 12% of the state's population is black, and around 5% of the state's population is Asian. And yet, once again, you can see how whites are overrepresented when it comes to having districts where they represent a majority of voters. So 23 out of the 38 congressional districts have a white majority, and 89 out of the 150 House districts have a white majority, and 20 out of the 31 state Senate districts, once again, have a white majority. So clearly people of color here in the state of Texas are not represented based upon the rich diversity we enjoy here in the state of Texas. Department of Justice. Yes.
Let me just give you a heads up. You got about 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Department of Justice and the new maps. Federal lawsuit alleges that the new maps violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Government argues the maps were drawn with discriminatory intent, a rush process, and done with an overall disregard for the fact that Texas's population growth has been driven almost entirely by racial minorities. Our investigation determined that Texas redistricting plans will dilute the increased minority voting strength, and that should have developed from these significant demographic shifts that should have developed, I should say, from those demographic shifts. Winners and losers, incumbents, Republicans, to an extent Democrats, lawyers, once again, because of the ultimate legal challenges that will emerge, tech companies that market redistricting technology, political polarization, the gridlock, the overtly partisan agenda that will be pursued by the legislature. Losers include voters, bipartisanship, trying to reach a consensus, challengers who don't have name recognition, who haven't performed constituent service, who don't have support amongst special interests. I found this pretty interesting. This is attitudes among Texans about redistricting. So the poll question, how much of a problem when one party controls all branches and legislative districts? Excuse me, let me reread this. How much of a problem when one party controls all branches and as a result, legislative districts are intentionally drawn to favor of this? This was a study, a poll conducted by U of H in Texas Southern. And I don't know how well you all can see this, but 56% of white Texans said this is a problem. in this case, a major problem. 62% of Latinos here in the state of Texas said that this is a major problem, and 67% of Black Texans said this is a major problem. You can see that 65% of women said this is a major problem. 54% of men said it's a major problem. 76% of Democrats said it's a major problem. 57% of independents, even a plurality of Republicans said that this is a major problem, even though Republicans benefit, obviously, under the status quo. But the question is, if Texas does become a competitive two-party state or potentially even a blue state, then Republicans would essentially be in the position Democrats are currently in. And we can see this, once again, has major implications upon the state. Some solutions would be independent panels in all states, public pressure to draw competitive districts, litigation used as a tool throughout our nation's history to challenge what many people feel is unjust and unconstitutional laws that exist on the books there. So I do apologize for the technical issues and problems. I know my colleague, Patricio Mesqua, wishes he was here to co-present with myself. I know we only have another minute or so, but if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. No questions? Well, that's one of the reasons why we oftentimes limit the amount of time for questions. Either that or I was so thorough that you now know everything about redistricting there. I think I'll run with that. Leanne, did
You
we
were
have?
very thorough, and I look forward to seeing your presentation at TCCTA.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone's time. I see it's 10:40, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Will.
No problem.